One of the comments that I see sometimes when I'm talking about Pastor John MacArthur in relationship to the pandemic is a statement that he made a while ago where he said there is no pandemic. And that is a statement that a lot of people have taken issue with, and so I do see criticisms of Pastor John MacArthur because he made that statement. I think even in my last video someone commented that I need to tell the truth and say that Pastor MacArthur said that. And so I actually want to revisit that. I actually did a video on that when he made that statement. I encourage you to go and watch that video because I not only show some of what he says there, but I also show a doctor who clarifies some things in terms of the statistics on COVID-19. And that doctor that I show, by the way, in that video is not someone who was necessarily in favor of lockdowns. I think he seemed to be a very objective, fact-based doctor. And so I thought what he had to say was worth hearing. Before I show you Pastor MacArthur's clip, though, I know that some people will criticize the fact that I keep covering Pastor MacArthur, but I just want to say that one of the reasons I do that is because a lot of people really are interested in this situation. It is a national story, and I do videos, and some of those videos don't get a lot of views, but when I talk about Pastor MacArthur, it's clear that my audience is very interested in this subject. And so one of the reasons that I talk about this is because I know so many people are curious and interested in his situation. Another reason, though, is that Pastor John MacArthur is a national figure and he has taken a very public stance in the pandemic situation. He has continued to keep his church open in spite of government restrictions in California. And so this is really big national news, and I think it's worth covering. Also, I have said that his church really is a test case in terms of how we think about the pandemic, because they are a large church and the government has had tight restrictions saying that if you open up your church, you're really putting people in danger. So I've just found it really important as well as fascinating to look at what's happening with Grace Community Church as they've continued to meet indoors over these months. Anyway, with all that said, let me let you hear what John MacArthur said, and keep in mind this is August 30th. And I will play a little bit of what he's saying here just so you can hear the context.
I haven't made really any comments about COVID or the lockdown and whatever else is going on in what is called a pandemic. I don't want to offer myself as any kind of an expert, but
before he goes on, I just want to point out there that he does say he's not offering himself up as a health expert. So I think that's important to keep in mind as you assess what he's saying. He's really talking from a pastoral perspective. He is just someone who really wants to make sure that he watches out for the people that he's leading. He doesn't want them to be misguided, and he wants to make sure that the decisions that they make as a church are done based on truth and facts.
A rather telling report came out this week, and for the first time, we heard the truth. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which is the national organization, government organization that is to report to us the truth about disease, said that in truth. 6% of the deaths that have occurred can be directly attributable to COVID. 94% cannot.
I'll comment on that too, because that's something a lot of people take issue with. Again, if you watch that other video I did, I give some clarifying information. He does say there that 6% of deaths are directly attributable to COVID-19, but it does leave the question, what about the other 94% of deaths? Did COVID have somewhat of a factor? Was it a major factor? And so that's really important to keep in mind as you look at these statistics. But yes, he is kind of, I would say, overstating the case there as he talks about that statistic. But let's hear how he says it.
Of the 160,000 people that have died, 9,210 actually died from COVID. There is no pandemic.
So So that's the statement a lot of people took issue with when he said there is no pandemic. And as you can tell, it created a lot of reaction. Even with his congregation, it was a lot of positive reaction. But with some people, it was negative reaction. But he goes on to give some of his thinking and reasoning behind what he's saying here.
And that's what you've been thinking. We have the responsibility, I think, as spiritual leaders, to be patient until the truth emerges. We've all been suspicious of the fact that we've been meeting together now for weeks and weeks and weeks. We don't know anyone who's ill. Nobody in our congregation has ever been to the hospital with this. It's clear to us the fabrication of numbers because they're including people who had 2 or 3 comorbidities. We know all of that. We know there are reasons for this that have nothing to do with the virus. There's another virus loose in the world, and it's the virus of deception. And the one who's behind the virus of deception is the arch deceiver, Satan himself. And it's not a surprise to me that in the midst of all this deception, the great effort that is going on is to shut down churches that preach the gospel. So, this is not a political speech, by the way. But it does not surprise me that they want to shut down those who preach the gospel, because the architects of this level of deception are not a part of the kingdom of heaven. They're a part of the kingdom of darkness.
So what he's basically talking about there is that he believes, and this is theological, he really believes that the government is doing something that is threatening to the gospel. And that is his concern. Again, he's coming at this from a pastoral perspective. He's trying to be protective of the church. And I think that's what really the heart and the mentality behind the statements that he has given. Remember, he did say he's not a health expert in what he's saying, but obviously people took issue with what he said, and I can understand where they're coming from. But another thing to keep in mind is the context that he's out in California, and this is at the end of August. So it's really interesting if you look at the statistics here of COVID-19. This is throughout the year in California, and what I wanted to point out here is the amount of new cases each day. And if you look this time of year where he's talking, the amount of cases is really actually going down. It's really quite limited. So when he says there is no pandemic, he's talking partly from an experiential standpoint. He says he doesn't know anybody who's been ill or has died from this disease. I think what he says there is no one in their church has had this illness. But if you look here, the amount of cases each day at that time, it's actually quite low. The population of California is 40 million people, and the population of Los Angeles County, where he is, I think is 10 million people. So, a couple of thousand cases, or even 4,000 or 5,000 cases, which is around that time each day, is really not that many in relationship to that size of a population. And that's the cases each day. If you actually look at the deaths attributed to COVID each day, you're looking at really at that time, there are days leading into that there are over 100 deaths. But then right around that time, it's actually going down to under 100 deaths a day, for some days at least. Some days are over 100. But as you can see, just in general, the amount of deaths per day is somewhere around 100 and sometimes less. And in a population, in a state with 40 million people, that many deaths per day is not really that noticeable. What's interesting in all this is that at that time, I can see why people would say something like Pastor MacArthur, why are we having all these tight restrictions when actually the spread of the disease is not rising and it's actually gone down? And that, I think, is really the issue taking place at that time, that the government just wasn't letting up in California, at least from how I remember it. But then you do see a rise in cases as you get to the end of October into November here. The amount of cases in California are definitely going up. And it's actually right around this time that the government loosens restrictions And of course, that's because of legal reasons and the Supreme Court. But it's just fascinating to me that this is when you can actually see, and you're probably going to experience the effects of the pandemic more right around this time. And yet this is when the government is actually loosening their restrictions. So I'm sure we have a lot of opinions on all of this, but I just wanted to be honest with what he said and with what the numbers actually were. And I can kind of understand where he's coming from, to be honest, because at the time, statistically speaking, it really wasn't a dangerous time, I don't think, and yet there were really tight restrictions. This also gets into the question of how do we define an epidemic and a pandemic. And one definition that I read is that an epidemic is disease that is above the baseline expectation. So what's interesting about that is if you define it that way, and I think that's more of a technical definition, then a disease like the coronavirus that is a new disease in our population, just having any amount of it is actually considered an epidemic because it's anything above what's expected. And so in 2020, we before that time hadn't had that disease. So just by definition, it sounds to me like any spread of this disease creates what we would call an epidemic, or what some people would call an epidemic. So in a technical sense, I can see what people are saying, that when he says there is no pandemic, technically there is a pandemic even at this time at the end of August. But in an experiential and kind of common parlance, the way we normally talk sense, I can also see what Pastor MacArthur is saying, because 3,000-4,000 cases a day in a state with 40 million people, I know it's still a lot of cases, but most of those people are not dying, and so statistically speaking, the danger is really limited. That being said, I do see that there is a rise in cases here, and it's something we should be taking a look at. I've always said we should take reasonable precautions based on the actual level of risk, but that it can be very hard to assess the level of risk because of all of the agendas and forces at work in our culture. So that's some information and thoughts that I wanted to share. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Please try to keep those comments constructive and helpful to this conversation. Thank you so much for listening to what I have to say from A Frisch Perspective.